friend took me to the village of Eyam. There was some mention of it being touched by the plague at some time, and I must admit, I really didn't know much about the plague, but thought a little bit of history in the charming village might make an interesting place to visit.
And as a result, I stumbled into an interesting coincidence, the conclusion of which led me to think about the paradox of us humans, how we are just incredible at creating solutions to solve our problems, but paradoxically, we seem also to be capable of bringing destruction upon ourselves. Sounds a bit heavy, I know, from walking around the village, but anyway, this is the story of what happened. Once we got to the village, we found our way to the cottages that were here during the plague of 1665. I read how a couple of religious leaders showed insightful leadership that contained the outbreak and stopped it spreading beyond the village. I'll get back to that story in a moment. But as I read about the event, it got me thinking about what was it like for the people who lived there. What did they endure? What did they feel? Was there terror? Were they frightened? What was that awful experience like? What did they have to endure, I wondered. So I turned to Wikipedia to see what I could find out about what seems to be a devastating disease and its effect on humanity. Clearly, I couldn't get into the minds of the villagers. In fact, how do we even begin to understand how they saw the world 400 years ago? The plague may be the biggest catastrophe that humans have experienced in the last 1,000 years. There were 3 pandemics, and it's possible that the death toll exceeded 200 million. These numbers are not only tragic, but they raise the question about what effect they had on total populations. We live in a world of over 7 billion people. But what was the population in 1665 when the plague visited Eyam? I wondered about this and wanted to put it in context, so I looked at the world's population over the last millennium. I found the result surprising. Why was the growth so slow? If we think about humans procreating, we would expect that if we had no birth control, good healthy conditions, consider a couple, with no restrictions, they might have at least 10 children. 20 years later, those 10 children might start their own families, and they would produce another 10 children, and in another 20 years they would start raising their own families. At first sight, it seems to me that we would expect that the population would grow very quickly, and if we graphed it, it would approximate to an S shape. But clearly that's not what has happened, at least up until 1800. We know that the Victorians often had large families of 10 or more children, so it doesn't seem unreasonable to assume that there would be large families in the Middle Ages, but in fact the opposite happened. In the Middle Ages, the population might have declined as much as 40%. It took 200 years for the population to recover to its previous levels. Clearly, the growth of the population was being regulated. But by what? There were few options of birth control, so what caused this unexpected result? As if we didn't already know, living on the planet Earth is a dangerous proposition, but in the Middle Ages it was far more dangerous. We might say the bottom line is, if nature doesn't get you, then your fellow humans might. If you grew ill in medieval times, survival might be a matter of luck. In the Middle Ages, the infant mortality rate may have been as high as 50%. Violence was rampant, with numerous uprisings and wars, and of the many physical challenges that people faced, it was perhaps famine and disease that presented the biggest threat. Famines occurred repeatedly, and with a lack of knowledge, disease was rampant. The plague is a deadly disease where there's a 70% chance of death if left untreated. There was no treatment until the 1940s, when the first antibiotics became widely available. In the 1600s, it was believed that the plague and other diseases were carried by bad air, otherwise known as the miasma theory. Modern medical practice believes the disease is transmitted by flea bites. During the second pandemic, there's an outbreak of the plague in London that came to be known as the Great Plague. I thought it was instructive, at least for me, to pause and think about the conditions under which people were living in those times. Houses that had an infected person marked their doors with a red cross to warn others of the dangers. Carts toured the city with the shrill cry of "Bring out the dead," and the bodies would be loaded onto a cart to be taken to mass burial graves. The plague was mostly confined to London, with one notable exception, the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. So the story goes, in 1665 a bundle of cloth was delivered from London to the local tailor. Unfortunately, it was flea infested. Within a week, the tailor's assistant, George Vickers, was dead, and it didn't take long until others started dying. The plague had arrived, and as the villagers well knew, it had the potential to devastate the population. What were they to do? There was no Institute of Health or National Health Service to call. Although the people of the village knew many of them would be doomed, they acted in a way that would save the lives of many people in the surrounding towns and villages. Two religious leaders, the rector and a Puritan minister, helped reduce the spread of disease by implementing some simple guidelines. Families were required to bury their own dead. Church services were held in an open amphitheatre where people could distance from each other. But perhaps their most famous precaution was to quarantine the village. Traffic in and out of the village was stopped. Food was brought from the outside and left at the village boundary. And here we see an interesting insight into the times. As payment for the food, villagers would leave coins in the hollow of a large stone. This hollow was filled with a concoction called the Four Thieves vinegar. This mix of vinegars and herbs was believed to be a prophylactic against the plague. Once again, I was pondering on what it must have been like for the people of Eyam to be quarantined off from the rest of the world. To try and think about this just a little bit, remember that the plague had been plaguing humanity for hundreds of years. It must have seemed to them that just like the weather, there was nothing you could do about the plague. It's possible that in their minds it had existed forever and would continue to do so. But recall that we're talking about 1665, and up to that point, germs were just a theory. The very notion of germs was a theory still in its infancy. The first proof of germs did not appear until 1813. Imagine then, in 1665, the idea of germs was probably unknown to the villagers of Eyam. It's likely they still believed that illness, like the plague, was carried by bad air. Think about it though. Even the idea of air might have been foreign to the villagers. What did that term mean? But oxygen was not identified until well over 100 years later, so I assume they would not have understood air the way that we do. This brings us to one side of the paradox. By the middle of the 20th century, the plague was contained by treatment with antibiotics. But how did this come about? On the surface, seems like a silly question, but I think it's important that we observe that solutions to problems like the plague were not written on a stone left by some visiting alien. It was scientific research that provided these solutions. I find this to be quite amazing. We get up one day with a body of knowledge, and during the day we make a discovery. so that when we go to bed there is more knowledge in the world than there was the day before. All of this we can attribute to our minds. Quite amazing, I think. So as I wandered through this inquiry, I realised that in 1665 the people of Eyam faced a world in which there was almost no scientific knowledge. The plague was inevitable. All in all, the chances of survival were minimal. How different then is Eyam today? The challenges of 1665 are long gone. There are no plague epidemics. We are very knowledgeable compared with the villages of 1665. Progress that is all attributable to the power of our minds. But the village had much more to show me. By the time I'd finished, I'd been reminded of the paradox of human creativity. So on a chilly afternoon, I was able to stroll through the village and enjoy the peace and quiet. Then, close by, the church bells started ringing. So I walked across the churchyard and through the old wooden doors. As in so many villages, towns and cities across the country, poppies remind us of the cost of human life and injuries that war brings us. Inside the church, there are reminders everywhere of the cost of the Great War on this village. The villagers who gave their lives in the trenches, reminders of those who objected to the war, and reminders of the nurses and doctors who dealt with the inevitable carnage that was the cost of moving the front forward a few hundred yards after months of fighting. It will be hard to stand here and not be reminded of the mothers whose sons and daughters left the village never to return, their lives left unfulfilled, their mothers left enduring a terrible fate, outliving their children. In the Great War, 10 million mothers never saw the child who emerged from their wombs come home. 7 million civilians perished. But that was just the beginning. The mobility of the 70 million people involved in the war contributed to the spread of influenza at the end of the war, resulting in a pandemic that killed as many as 100 million people. The tragedy of the Great War is the death and destruction it brought to humanity. What's remarkable is that so many people were killed in such a short time. This was industrialized war. It turns out that our inventiveness is indifferent. It's as though we were given a gift from the gods, but how we use it is up to us. The paradox. We can conquer the plague or kill millions. It's our choice.